Okay. All right. Tonald, Drump, and Nhristian Cationalism. This episode is sponsored to you by Bizarro Superman. I don't know if you know who that dude is. Google Bizarro Superman. This is a dude who was a Superman from like a backwards planet. All right. So the sponsor of this episode is Bizarro Superman. Your world is Bizarro. All right. Tonald, Drump, Nhristian Cationalism. That's obviously supposed to say Donald Trump and Christian nationalism. All right. So last night, Strack and I were going to do an episode entitled Trump, Christian Nationalism, and the Crubberies. All right. We were going to do an episode called that. But we had some family situations come up. We were unable to record. So because next Thursday is Thanksgiving and that's when we drop, we're going to do an episode on Tuesday night that furthers what I'm about to say now. But as I was doing research and studying and all this stuff, we've talked about Christian nationalism. We've made snippet statements here and there. But it is all the rage once again. And I looked at a bunch of different articles, read things, stumbled across the homie Ruslan. He had a great conversation with, I don't know this brother. I know he's a believer, solid brother. What Do You Meme? I think is his YouTube channel. And so watch that conversation and enjoyed that. I meant to text Ruslan and tell him that was a good one, but I texted him about a different conversation. So as I was thinking about this idea of Christian nationalism, I hear a lot of people push back against it, and I understand why. But I feel like some of the reasons why people are pushing back against Christian nationalism and Donald Trump, I feel like they're not as biblically sound. And I'm not saying anything like I have the answer, but I'm not Sway. I'm Sway. I don't have the answer. But I want to bring up one particular thing that I think we really need to consider if we're for Christian nationalism particularly, and if we're going to critique it. All right, so in preparing for the episode that Strack and I meant to do, we couldn't do because we had family issues last night, I came across an article about this book, The Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe. So I ordered the book because I thought, okay, here is someone taking this term, which is largely viewed as a negative term by those who started it, right? Now, let me just outset, I like to keep it 100, right? Let me keep it 1,000. I think Christian nationalism is largely being promoted by the conservative side because they're pushing back against the term being hijacked by the left and making it a bad thing, right? What's ironic to me is that when the left started using the term woke or talking about social justice, they were calling you social justice warrior and all those things. And when people were trying to explain what they meant, the conservative right weren't letting you take that term and use it in a positive way, but now they're taking Christian nationalism and using it in a positive way. What do I know? Jokes on whoever, right? But anyway, that's not the point of what I'm trying to make. So as I was looking at this book, and I decided this is what I do when I buy books. When I buy a book on Amazon, you always have a little bit of time before you can cancel that thing, right? So if I see or I read an article and something intrigues me about to get a book, and I buy it, I got Prime membership, comes quick, but I got a little bit of time. I'll go on YouTube and see if they talk about the book. I'll watch a couple of interviews with the person, and if I feel like I understand what they're saying already, I'll cancel the book. And if I feel like, oh, this is actually interesting, I want to read it more, I'll keep the book coming. So I went to Cross Politic. I know those guys. Toby, Knox is a buddy of mine. Toby, I've been on their show. I watched him on their show. And here's what he said from this book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. Here's what he said on their show. And this brought to my mind one thing that I think we have to really consider that I don't hear many people saying. Here's how he describes what he means by Christian nationalism. Here's what he said. This is a quote. A collective sense of we, right, we as a collective entity exist, and then we're going to arrange ourselves for our God, and that God includes earthly and heavenly life. So this is a question in response to Chocolate Knox from the Cross Politic YouTube video, or their podcast, but I saw it on YouTube. And then he said, what do you mean by nationalism? And Stephen Wolfe, who wrote the book, said this: a collective sense of we as a collective entity exist, and then we are going to arrange ourselves for our God, and that God includes earthly and heavenly life. That sounds like a cool definition. And Stephen Wolfe, I don't know him. He seems like he loves the Lord and a godly dude. I have nothing bad to say about him. But it brought to mind a couple of thoughts, because we have to think about where we live, right? We live in a democracy, not a theocracy, right? We don't live in a country where everyone believes in Jesus, even though we know scriptures like every knee will bow, every tongue confess. We know where to go out and make disciples, but this definition would work more when everyone is unified, because here's what he says in the definition: a collective sense of we. But we, who's the we? Like, it's not all Americans do not see themselves in a collective sense. In fact, the last time we all saw ourselves in a collective sense was 9/11. We all felt like we're united in a united front. That's a different conversation, that it takes a tragedy to make us feel united for a temporary period of time. We're usually not united by, what's interesting about America, we're the United States of America, but we're often united by what we're against more than what we're for. In 9/11, we were against terrorism, so we all felt like we were one. Well, there's not a collective sense of we right now, because if nothing else, the left and the right, there's no we between them. So when you start saying a collective sense of we as a collective entity exist, and we're going to arrange ourselves for our God. In a country like America, there's a bunch of different collective we's. So what if Muslims say, hey, we're a collective sense of we. We're going to arrange ourselves for our God, Allah, and that God includes earthly and heavenly life. So we want to pass Sharia laws because we think our God would do. This is the problem you run into when you have a definition like this. It presupposes that people accept Christianity, think like Christians, and then this makes total sense. If you're a Christian, who wouldn't want that? But this definition could be used by any collective sense of we in promotion of changing laws to fit what they think honors their God, right? But here's the other problem with this kind of definition. You can do all of that, change laws, and force people to submit to laws, which they do in Muslim countries. You can do all of that and not love your neighbor at all, right? You can do all of those things and not love. You can change all the laws. You get rid of abortion. You get rid of every law that you don't like. And you can do all of that without obeying Jesus at all. You can do all of that without, because most of our politicians are not Christians and they make laws. It doesn't matter, right? You can change all those laws and not love your neighbor. They can be good for your neighbor in terms of, well, it's good to not kill people, but that has nothing to do with the actual commands that Jesus says. Here's the other problem with this idea of Christian nationalism, which is essentially a manifesto for political, cultural engagement. Here's the other problem. And most people won't say this. Cross Politic, and those are great guys. I have no problem with them. I don't agree with everything they say, but so what? They don't agree with everything I say. Here's the problem, though. They are theonomists, and they're post-millennial, if I'm not mistaken. Why am I saying that? Because your eschatology has more to do with your political ideology than explicit biblical commands, right? So if I am a post-millennial, which means I think the earth, everyone's going to eventually grow and get better and do good and submit themselves to Christ over time, then my engagement in politics will look more like we need to change laws and make people submit to Jesus. But if you're not post-mill, or you're not a theonomist, which means that the whole world should be governed by biblical command and biblical law. I mean, I'm just using generalities. I'm not here to get into details about theonomy. You can look that stuff up. But my point is, they have a particular eschatology, the end time position, and they have a particular framework for how they think the world should work, of course you're going to think this stuff works that way. Your eschatology has more to do. But if you're like me, I'm not post-mill. I'm not a theonomist. I don't think the world is going to eventually submit to Christ. I think he's going to come back. It's going to be chaos. And then when it's all said and done, all the people who submitted to Christ will submit to him for eternity and all of that. I'm not a post-mill. I don't see that biblically speaking. So that affects the way I view politics. So I don't put a lot of hope in non-Christian politicians to pass laws that are Christian. But that's not the main issue either. I'm just getting to the point. I'm nibbling a little bit so that I can get to this main point in just a second. And Toby Sumpter created a video in response to Jonathan Leeman's critique of Christian nationalism. You can look this up on YouTube. I think it's entitled TikTok Christianity. And in his video, he came up with a new term for Christian nationalism, calling it lordship nationalism, which essentially is that we should hold that everyone submits to Christ because he is Lord, right? And none of us who are genuine Christians would disagree with that. But I think the manner in which he's talking would probably be different than what I'm thinking. So he used Romans 13, and in particular, he was quoting Romans 13, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he used this verse as part of his justification for Christian nationalism, which was essentially this. Romans 13, if you don't know, is the submit to governing authorities passage. And here's what he says. He didn't quote the verse, but he kind of speaks using this verse sort of in the backdrop of what he's saying. He says this. This is what it says in verse 4 of Romans 13. For he, being the governing authorities, is God's servant for your good. So God's servant. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, again, and the avenger of those who carry out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. And here was his point. Here's what he said. This is what God says. For the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. So here's the point that I think he was trying to make. And if I'm misrepresenting you, Toby, if you watch this, I apologize. I'm not having direct quotes. I'm not that high profile yet. But I get some more subscribers. We're going to step our game up. We're going to just want to know. Y'all keep coming, right? But here's what I think he was saying. That this verse, them being ministers of God, means that they are biblically required to submit to God and execute the ministry that is of God. So in other words, seeing public civil servants, whether they're Christians or not, as ministers of God according to this Romans 13:6, and that's part of why he thinks lordship salvation is actually the better sort of term to govern what Christians should do. Should be demanding that these civil magistrates, because they're ministers of God, teach, submit, and create laws in light of the fact of what God's word says. He's a theonomist. It makes sense to me. Okay? If I'm misrepresenting him, I apologize. I'm not here to badmouth anyone. I'm here to point out something that I want to push back against. All right? That's what he says. Here's the problem with that logic, I think. When you get to that point, here's the problem with that logic. Not the lordship nationalism phrase, but this idea that they're ministers of Christ, and therefore we should be demanding that they submit to Christ in that way. Here's the problem with that. Romans 13 was not written to 20th century, 21st century Americans. Think about that statement, think about that as an early Jew, back when Paul wrote it in like the 50s or 60s, right? Think about hearing that statement about submitting to the governing authorities when Rome is the occupied governing authority in your day and age. You're not thinking of demanding that they submit to Christ. You think they're ministers of Christ? These Roman soldiers are raping Jewish women. They're forcing your grandfather to carry a 100-pound chest 2 miles. When Jesus talked about when someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2, he was talking about the Romans. That's stuff that the Roman soldiers would do, right? Those early Christians are not thinking, oh, these are ministers of Christ, and let's demand that they submit to Christ. That wasn't what they would have understood. That wasn't the point. The term ministers of Christ is not people who obey God. It's just people given a position under the sovereignty of the Lord, right? That's the issue. But then think about this from a different angle. What if you're in a Muslim country and the Bible's translated in your language and you read Romans 13? It's going to say they are ministers of Christ, but these people worship Allah. If you go to China, this passage is not written, so it makes sense in America because we think America is a Christian nation. Yeah, they're ministers of Christ. We need to demand that. But is that really what that passage is saying? Of course it isn't. There's no way that's what that passage is saying. Now, we can desire that. We're not talking about what we would want to see happen. We're talking about, is the Bible commanding us to address the culture and change laws because they are servants, ministers of Christ? No, that's a sovereignty term, not a salvific term. God isn't saying that these people, the governing authorities, they're mostly corrupt in other nations. But they're called ministers of Christ, right? You're going to go demand that the imam in Iran submits to Christ? Yeah, right. That's not the point of the passage. But even then, that's not the point I want to make. I want to make one more point, and then we're done. Here's the greater problem with Christian nationalism. Because they shape it like we as a collective sense need to influence and change laws. Now, don't get me wrong. We live in a society where we're allowed to vote our consciences. There's nothing wrong with that. But we're talking about changing laws that we as Christians believe people should submit to our God, right? Through the law. This isn't through relationship. This isn't through, it's changing laws that we think reflect what God wants, right? Here's the challenge with that. That's not Christian at all, because you won't find any passages that tell Christians that we should do that. That's Mosaic nationalism. It's Mosaic nationalism. It's trying to get people to submit to God through law. That's Mosaic nationalism. And here's the challenge. It didn't work for the Jews when they were a theocracy in the Old Testament. It's not going to work for America in the New Testament. What they're calling Christian is really Mosaic nationalism. Let's change laws and get people to submit to the authority of Christ. And so I'll support a guy like Tonald Drump because he's for the changing of law. No, Donald Trump is for the opposition of whoever. Donald Trump is not a conservative. He's a Caesar, right? He doesn't care. We'll get into that when me and Strack cover this in greater detail on Tuesday night. That dude called him Rod the Sanctimonious. Oh man, it's about to be crazy. Somebody stop me. That dude has a mask on. He's Jim Carrey, the sequel. But that's a different conversation, all right? The reality is it's Mosaic nationalism. Let's change people's lives through law. But we hear from Romans 7 this very reality, right? Here's what Paul says about the law. And this is what puzzles me when Christians are offended that non-Christians are pushing back against the desire to change laws. Because here's what Paul said about the law in Romans 7. You guys should know this well, right? Paul said this, "For what shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet had it not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kind of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died." Here's what Paul's saying. Once I was told, don't do this, I desired to do it. And then I did it, right? Because that's the impact of laws. Human nature wants to rebel against whatever laws are in place. So Paul said, even something like as beautiful and holy as the Mosaic law, it produced a lot of covetousness in me. It did because I desired to do the things that it said not to do. That's from God, straight direct. For the good of all people, the Jews, they couldn't do it because it did the opposite. What do we think is going to happen if we try to impose laws in America? It's going to do the opposite. So if it didn't work for the Jews, the imposition of law, and those were perfect, godly, holy laws, they came directly from God. Why do we think it's going to work in America? It doesn't work that way, brothers and sisters. That is not what we're hearing people describe, even from and again, I haven't read his book. I haven't read The Case for Christian Nationalism yet. But even what he's describing in this book, this is Mosaic nationalism. It's not Christian. Now, let me offer one last thing, and then I'm out of here. And this is the main point to me. I think Christian nationalism has essentially said, we make disciples through changing laws, not developing relationships. That's what's happened. We've reduced it down to almost the 10 commandments, but not the 10 commitments, right? Christ gave us commitments like, do unto others as you have them do to you. Matthew 7:12, Galatians 6:10. Therefore, as we have opportunity, do good to everyone, especially those in the household of faith, right? Galatians 6:10. 1 Corinthians 5, Paul said, I don't judge the outside world. I don't judge unbelievers. But all we see is Christians calling out, look at what these Christians are doing. Look at what they're doing. Look at what the trans community is doing. Look at what they're doing. Paul said, I don't judge them because I judge the people among you. Don't judge these folks. 2 Timothy 2:26, these people have been taken captive to do the devil's will. They got bigger problems than if they vote for abortion or not. We've lost that. We've lost that sense of that sense of the commitment to build community. It's changed to now the cultural mandate for us has now become the commitment to change laws that will force people to submit to Christ. And all it's going to do is force people to hate Christ. Because even Christ didn't force people to believe in him. He lived among them, created relationships with them, taught them, and then he died for them, right? The challenge with Christian nationalism today, and even with, I like lordship nationalism, but the way Toby Sumpter is describing it, the way Stephen Wolfe is describing it, to me, is Mosaic nationalism. So Toby Sumpter offered a third view, lordship salvation. Let me offer a fourth view that I think is actually more biblical, and it's called Good Samaritan nationalism. We need Good Samaritan nationalism, not Christian, not Mosaic, and not lordship, right? Now, when I say lordship, don't get me wrong. I agree in theory. But we need Good Samaritan nationalism. And let me tell you why. Because when Jesus talked about loving your neighbor, right? Christian nationalism says loving your neighbor is creating laws that are good for them, whether they like them or not. That's not how God talked about loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor is to call down judgment against them when they sin. That's not what he talked about. In Luke chapter 9, when Jesus sent two of his disciples to go ask the Samaritans, can he walk through their village? And they said no. The disciples were like, Lord, should we call down fire from heaven to destroy him? He was like, no, don't do that. And then you get to Luke chapter 10 and you get the Good Samaritan narrative, right? So so let me offer this perspective, because what Christian nationalism misses is this force people to submit to laws, but Jesus didn't do that. So here, you know the story. A religious leader comes up and he says, Lord, who is my neighbor? Right? And Jesus tells him a story. A man was walking down this part of town. He was jumped and beaten by robbers, left for dead. A priest comes, a Levite comes, people who know the law very well. They walk past him. Another guy comes, picks him up, takes him to an inn, pays for him to be taken care of for, says, I'll be back tomorrow to pay for whatever else you do, right? And then Jesus said, which one of those three was a neighbor? And they said, the last one. Jesus said, go and do likewise. That's very important. Go and do likewise. Here's what Christian nationalism today, how they would process that story. Here's what the way they define it. Here's what I think they would want you to do. They walk down the street. They see the guy on the side of the road. And so they go get the local magistrate, and they try to change the law to put more soldiers on the street so that people don't get robbed on that street. And we need to change laws about how you walk and when you walk and where you walk and all this stuff so that people understand that this is a dangerous road. Now, that's not a bad thing, but that's not what Jesus said do. See, that's you could say that's loving your neighbor. And on one level, it's true. That's not what Jesus said do. See, Jesus said loving your neighbor is personal sacrifice. The guy did it himself. It's personal investment, personal sacrifice. It wasn't, let's change the way we see this road and get the leaders and who are in authority to make decisions. Let's vote them in who are going to put. No, he said, you go do this. You see, loving your neighbor is not something that you do on a corporate civic level. I mean, I'm not saying it's absent to love your neighbor if you change laws. That's not what I'm saying. But that's what we have changed into the dominant way we love our neighbors. That's not what Jesus was saying. That's a personal thing. There's investment in this. There's investment. That guy, when he wakes up and realizes what this guy did for him, he's going to be like, I'm indebted to you. You saved my life. There's a relationship. Why did you save my life? Because I believe in Jesus. And I didn't want to leave you there. That guy might become a Christian. But you change laws and you vote and you get upset at people who disagree with you in those laws. And you say this law is for loving your neighbor. That's true, but that's not what we're commanded to do. Go and do likewise is not see people as people that need to submit to the lordship of Christ. That's too militaristic. Yeah, we do that. But Jesus did that in a way that's different from what these modern day Christians are saying we should do. Don't believe the hype. Much more I could say. Much more I could say. There's so much good. No, I'm not good at doing Donald Trump. Tonald! Not good at doing that. Me and Strack on Tuesday night are doing a cross-examine. We're going to double down. There's a lot I'm not saying that we can talk about. But for what it is now, understand that a lot of this is Mosaic nationalism, brothers and sisters. This is not Christian. Christians don't force anyone to submit. Jesus didn't force anyone to believe in him. And we're not supposed to either. And the Bible never tells us to change laws. Now, don't get me wrong. Vote our convictions. I'm not saying that. Vote your convictions. But if you're treating people who don't have your convictions with disdain, then you're not Christian at all. What do I know? I'm an ex-street gangster. That's a pastor that needs to lose a person. Kirk Kennedy, signing off. Go get that Serial Killer Still Smiling mixtape from KirkKennedy.com. If you don't, you do not know Jesus. See?